Hello one and all, Jasper here, the second most knowledgeable person in all of New Mexico on the topic of Game of Thrones. Now that may not sound too impressive, but when you realize where George R.R. Martin lives, you'll understand why it's difficult for me to be anything above New Mexico. It's kind of like trying to be the strongest man in Scotland right now. But anyways, back to the topic at hand. This is my first real YouTube video, and I had to ask myself, what kind of video should it be about? Well, my opinion, of course, since I'm sure everyone wants to know what that is. But my opinion on what? Music? Honestly, I'll listen to anything depending on my mood. Sabaton when I'm working out, country when I'm driving home to visit the family, rap when I want to punish myself, and 69 when I feel like snitching on my coworkers. Food? Well, so long as it isn't healthy, I'll probably won't have any issues with it. Politics? Oh, come on. Do I look stupid enough to mix politics and entertainment, thus alienating half my audience? Yes. Luckily, we'll be talking about fictional politics in a fictional world with characters so conservative they make Alex Jones look like Cenk Uygur. So surely, no one would be offended if I were to judge and critique all the kings of Westeros. Game of Thrones. A series and novel that I love so much that I can't help but talk about how much I hate Game of Thrones. My abusive relationship with this franchise has gotten to a point where I recommend to my friends that if they start the show, to stop after the 4th season and tell themselves it was unjustly cancelled. I still and likely will always recommend the books, even though we are at a point where I would bet everything I own that the books will never be finished. But enough about all that doom and gloom. Let's get to the title of this video that made those beginning jokes a slog to get through. Ranking the Kings of Westeros. Now, a couple of things to clear up before we get started. What I mean is Kings of Westeros, not kings in Westeros. There is a big difference. Talking about kings that only sat on the Iron Throne is far easier, seeing as there's only 18 of them. If we bring in the kings of the North, the West, the Vale, and all the other regions of Westeros, then that small list of 17 kings suddenly grows to over 200. Second, we are only going to be talking about kings who had the title before the beginning of the books. So, Robert will be on this list, however Joffrey will not. The reason being is, I think it's safe to say that in the future Game of Thrones, the people will likely not have Joffrey as an actual king. He'll likely get the same treatment as Rhaenyra, who, by the way, will also not be on this list. However, my main motivation for Joffrey is that I have a different kind of video planned out for him, and if we're to have him on this one, I'll just make the next part of the video a little redundant. We will also mainly be focusing on the characters while they were king, but we will take into account any actions they had taken beforehand that would have had ramifications across the realm, positive or negative. Finally, at the time of this video, Fire and Blood has only reached 7 of the Targaryen kings, leaving more than half of them with their story untold. So a good chunk of these kings will be described very broadly. Some of these kings only have, they ruled wisely and justly, or they were a daft cunt. So I may have some bias for kings we know a bit more about in one way or another. Have everything squared away? Great. Then with that, let's get started with the worst king in all of Westeros. Number 18. Aegon IV, the Unworthy. The first 2 kings on this list should surprise no one, though I think the 4th lowest may be a bit of a shocker. I'm getting off topic though. Back to this fat prick. Aegon the Unworthy. George R.R. Martin's personal choice as the worst king Westeros had ever had, and I'm not one to argue. While you could make a very good argument for the next king on this list being the worst, the reason I decided to act like a sheep and place Aegon at the bottom was that in the grand scale of things, he did far more harm to the realm than any of the other kings in Westeros. Not only was this John Goodman look-alike unable to keep it in his pants, resulting in a long list of bastards being born from his cousin, who he cheated with on his sister. That's bad enough, but he was a massive piece of shit to his son. His son rightly called out his father on his ridiculous planned invasion of Dorne. Aegon ignored him, and when the fleet set sail, it was destroyed by a storm. His son harped on him for any deed he would make that seemed dishonorable, such as stealing wealth from his subjects and using it himself, sleeping with any woman he wished, married or otherwise, giving away priceless artifacts to anyone who would kiss his ass, including a situation where Aegon gave a dragon egg away. This soured their relationship so much so that it is rumored that Aegon himself would spread a lie that his son was actually not his true son, but that his sister wife pulled an Aegon and cheated on him with his brother. His worst act, however, was on his deathbed. Seemingly out of spite, he legitimized all of his bastard children, meaning they now all had a claim on the Iron Throne. This, along with the rumors he spread himself, would result in the Blackfyre Rebellion, one of the most disastrous wars Westeros ever had. But of course, not just one. The rivalry between the Targaryens and the legitimized bastards who took the name Blackfyre would last for generations. A total of 5 Blackfyre rebellions took place, though admittedly calling the second one a rebellion was a bit of a stretch. But the worst part is that this might not even be the end. Aegon's decisions are still being felt over 120 years after his death. So with that, I name the Aegon the Unworthy the worst king to have ever sat his ass on the Iron Throne. Shame it didn't cut him up. Number 17. Aerys II, the Mad King. The only king you can argue that might be worse than Aegon the Unworthy. While he didn't cause as many wars as that fat bastard, the reason was quite simple. The Targaryens lost the war he started. Simplifying it all, Aerys, despite starting off as a decent king, drifted into madness. At first he was just a bit paranoid and jumpy, but one day the Lord of Duskendale asked Aerys to come visit so they could talk about the taxes being put over them. Despite being warned not to accept, he did, and rode down to Duskendale, and he was promptly thrown into a jail cell and tortured. Though it was a very light torture, as the worst thing that was described was his beard was pulled. Not since I visited my local playground have I seen such cruelty. Anyways, as a hostage, there was little anyone could do to save him. His hand of the king, Tywin, "We don't negotiate with terrorists," Lannister, seemed hell-bent on storming the fortress despite the likelihood of Aerys being put to death. However, thanks to big, brass-balled Sir Barristan the Bold, he convinced Tywin to let him try to save the king. Tywin gave him a single day, likely so he wouldn't look bad in front of the other lords. Sadly, Barristan succeeded. When Lord Daenerys realized what had happened, he quickly surrendered and begged for mercy. And I think you can guess what Aerys went with. This plunged him further into madness and paranoia, which led to his greatest mistake. You see, his son Rhaegar, as reported by CNN and Fox News, kidnapped Lady Lyanna Stark. Naturally, her older brother got pissed, marched to the king, and demanded that she be set free. Aerys responded by imprisoning him and demanding that his father, Lord Rickard Stark, come down and stand trial. Not long after he arrived, a trial by combat was soon put forward, and in what can only be described as the Westeros version of "if the glove don't fit, you must acquit," Aerys named fire as his champion and burned Rickard alive while his son was being strangled. This had the massive domino effect, resulting in Rickard's son, Eddard, declaring war, since he was quite pissed about his father and brother being murdered. His best friend, Lord of the Stormlands, and betrothed to Lyanna, Robert Baratheon, declared war. Jon Arryn, who the king demanded to kill the two while they were living at his home, was disgusted by the command as it spat in the face of guest rights, and declared war. And finally, Hoster Tully, whose motivation was that his daughter was boinking Eddard. A massive civil war that not only resulted in thousands of men, women, and children dying, but also resulted in wiping out what was left of the Targaryen dynasty to just 2 kids, who spent the rest of their life practically alone and on the run. Small wonder that Aerys made it here, huh? Number 16. Maegor the First, the Cruel. Yeah, when you got the title The Cruel, you just might be a grade A asshole. I'll be honest, when I first started this list, I actually remember putting him much higher on the list. We're talking in the top 5 kings. I remember him being one cruel son of a bitch, but that the majority of the issues was due to his weak half-brother who was king before him. Then I reread Fire and Blood, along with rewatching the histories and lore, and it was a slap in the face. True, at the beginning of his reign you could put a good chunk of the blame on his brother. However, you would have to forget that he was a major cause of some of these issues, since despite being married to the High Septim's niece to help patch up the rocky relationship between the crown and the faith, he then had a secret Valyrian wedding. When word got out, he was banished, but the damage was already done and couldn't be fixed. Throw on top that he killed his nephew in battle to keep a hold of his crown, despite said nephew being the rightful heir. He had 3 more wives known as the Black Brides because he widowed all of them, one of them being Rhaenyra Targaryen, his niece and former wife to his nephew. Good God, before typing this out, I always knew that the Targaryens dabbled in the forbidden Florida tango, but this really is a family circle, isn't it? He was such a garbage king that despite riding Balerion, the largest and most powerful creature in the world, half the kingdom rose up in rebellion against him. Thankfully, though, he was either killed or committed suicide. His body discovered on the Iron Throne. My money is on murder because whatever my thoughts on him might be, he doesn't strike me as the kind of guy to wave the white flag. Number 15. Viserys I, the Young King. Viserys. He's a special kind of king, as when it comes to his policies, I have nothing to complain about. He ruled justly and was loved by the nobility and small folk alike. There wasn't a single war throughout his reign, so why is he so low on his list? Well, quite simply, it's because of Viserys' choice that resulted in the most disastrous war in Westeros history, bar none. The Targaryens would never be able to obtain the strength they held during Viserys' reign. And all because of Viserys. To simplify this as much as I reasonably can, Viserys was married twice, though luckily, unlike his great-great-uncle Maegor, it was not at the same time. His first wife passed away in childbirth, only giving him a single daughter, Rhaenyra. So he remarried, and his new wife had 5 children, the eldest being his son Aegon. And since it was a son, by the laws of Westeros, he should have been the first in line to inherit the throne. However, Viserys was quite fond of his daughter, so much so that he announced that it would be Rhaenyra who would be the one to inherit. Now, you can argue all you want about how progressive Viserys was, and that obviously he was right to insist that Rhaenyra should inherit the throne. However, the fact of the matter is the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Besides, he isn't on the list for insisting that his daughter take over. He's on the list because he didn't do anything more than just telling people that was what was going to happen. He didn't even seem to notice the 2 factions were forming under his nose, the Greens and the Blacks, each choosing either Aegon or Rhaenyra to inherit the throne. It was inevitable that civil war would break out. The only reason Viserion isn't lower on this list is because during his reign, he was actually a good king. Had he even been slightly less competent than he actually was, he would easily be the worst king in Westeros. Number 14. Aegon II, the Usurper. Good God. I'll be honest, I kind of feel bad for Aegon. As compared to any other king, he was dealt probably the worst hand you could get. Aegon IV and Aerys II are smirking as they're dealt a flush and a straight. Maegor has at least 2 bare, and Viserys is grinning ear to ear with a royal flush. But Aegon? He was dealt a 2 and a 7 that were offsuit. While you can judge him harshly for, wanting and trying to obtain the throne himself, as that was a key influence on the war breaking out, then there's some truth to that. But I mainly want to talk about his ineffectiveness as a king during the war and, in a way, after. You see, he took part in only a single battle, where he was crippled and unable to continue in any meaningful way. His brother Aemon took over after, probably thinking that he was destined for the throne since his brother would likely perish from his wounds. Though, with hindsight, we know that wasn't going to work out. Either way, the events had twisted him quite a lot. So much so that he had his sister burned and eaten by his dragon in front of her son, and despite the strongest claim against him being dead, and the second being his prisoner, he had the opportunity to make peace and choose not to continue the bloodshed. He could have pardoned those who chose to side with his sister. Instead, he seemed willing to continue the battle, threatening all sorts of punishment to what he looked at as filthy traitors. This was despite a very large army from the Riverlands marching to King's Landing. There was some hope of victory for him when the Baratheons went to intercept them. But they were crushed, and all hope was lost. Yet despite that, he had no intentions of surrendering. Because of this, he was eventually poisoned. While I pity the man for having the worst situation to inherit, I can't deny there were plenty of things he could have done to at least make the entire event a little less of a shit show. And for those of you wondering, I think Rhaenyra is guilty as well in a lot of ways, though to a slightly lesser extent. So when placing her, consider her a little bit higher than Aegon here. Number 13, Daeron I, the Young Dragon. One of the shortest reigning monarchs throughout all of Westeros' history. And me personally, I only count the last year of his reign, considering while he was the king for several, it wasn't until his 16th name day he actually had some control. And what did he do when he finally had some control? He went to war with Dorne. Now, at the beginning of his conquest, it actually didn't go too badly, as many of the nobility surrendered to him. Though that's the key word, nobility. The small folk, well, they were made of a stubborn cloth. They continued guerrilla warfare and fighting, making it almost impossible for Daeron to keep control. Any castle he took over, well, when he left the next day, the small folk would have overthrown it, killing any who he left in charge. This resulted in him losing nearly 60,000 men. And when he marched back to try and retake Dorne once again, well, he was ambushed and killed, also resulting in his cousin getting arrested and put in jail. This led to his brother Baelor taking charge, but we'll go into him later. But Daeron's entire legacy is a failed, botched battle with the Dornish. Number 12, Aenys the First. This king, despite being the son of Aegon the Conqueror, seemed to have misplaced his spine. I won't go so far as to say he inherited an amazing situation, as no matter who he was, he would have likely suffered the same rebellions that started. However, how he handled them was preposterous, as at first he sent ravens to the rebel leaders to ask why they were so unhappy with his ruling. Nobody told him that usually when war is declared, the time for talking has ended. It fell onto the local lords to deal with these rebellions themselves, resulting in Aenys looking even weaker in the eyes of the realm. The stress of being so hated smashed his previous ideas of being loved by everyone, so much so that after 5 years, when he heard about his children being under siege, he simply collapsed and died, leaving the Iron Throne ripe to be taken by his half-brother Maegor the Cruel. And that can pretty much summarize his entire reign. Hesitation, weakness, uncertainty. And obviously it's a very difficult state to be in, but when a father's first instinct or action of their children being in danger is to keel over and die rather than mounting his dragon to set the enemy ablaze, I mean, it's no wonder that he didn't last long. Number 11, Robert I, the Usurper. Here we go. From here on out, the kings we're talking about will actually have positive traits we can go over. But naturally, not being exactly famous for being amazingly good or amazingly bad, these kings tend to be kind of in the middle and not the most popular. If previous kings on this list were the Andrew Johnsons or James Buchanans of Westeros, then these next ones are the Chester Arthurs of Westeros. Ironically, though, despite my previous statement, Robert is not a very forgettable king. The second usurper on this list, and the only king whose last name isn't Targaryen. Instead, this is Robert Baratheon, and by putting him this low on the list, I have already mentally prepared myself for death. You see, not just in the Seven Kingdoms, but in the fandom as well, Robert is quite a popular king, which can be credited entirely to him actually appearing in the show and books. But this isn't about him as a person, this is about him as a king, and during times of war, you could find none better. You see, Robert, at the peak of his health and strength, was arguably the greatest fighter in all of Westeros. He may have not had the special skill of Arthur Dayne or Barristan Selmy, but his strength dwarfed their own and would pull in the advantage. And while his own strength was not on par with Gregor Clegane, his own skill and speed advantage would get him the win in that case. Not to mention he had an amazing charisma. In fact, the greatest thing that could have happened to him during his reign was war, as he seemed to be able to convince defeated foes to not only join him, but also to die for him if need be. He inspired so much loyalty that only a select few could have possibly despised him. Had he been in charge of a single kingdom, facing off against enemies on all sides, on all fronts, I dare say he would be considered the greatest king ever. Yet, that is not how his reign went. It was mostly peaceful, with only a single war cropping up. When the Greyjoys rebelled, thinking he didn't have the support of all the Seven Kingdoms, since he had just recently usurped the Targaryens, Robert showed them how wrong they were when he smashed their castle to bits with his warhammer and with the strength of all the Seven Kingdoms. Calling the conflict a war would probably be an overstatement. After all, if a grown-up pile drives a child, do you call that a fight? No, we call that old-fashioned parenting. Due to his reign being at peace, and with no one really to challenge him, Robert emptied the coffers of the royal treasury, spending it on tourneys, feasts, and any other activities he could think of that could use to bring himself a little closer to war without bringing up the whole thing. And despite inheriting a rather profitable kingdom when he overthrew Aerys II, he left it in shambles, not only financially, but also politically. After his death, Westeros would fall into a civil war where 5 kings would rise to claim the entirety or parts of Westeros, all because he didn't notice that his wife was shagging her brother behind his back, and those children of his were not actually his own. The War of the 5 Kings so far has been one of the most disastrous wars in Westeros history. Easily top 5, I would argue probably the 3rd. And it doesn't look like it will get any better. In fact, it only seems that more blood will flow. Number 10. Aerys I. Aerys was probably the most passive king on this entire list. While his reign was not exactly solid, since he took up being king not long after the first Blackfyre Rebellion, you can't really blame him, as that falls on his grandfather, Aegon the Lardass. Still, the only smart thing he seemed to make as king was to name his uncle Bloodraven as his hand, a very capable man who pretty much ruled the 7 kingdoms in his stead. Any other time Aerys seemed to make a decision as king, it seemed short-sighted, such as showing mercy to Aegor Rivers and allowing him to take the Black, a man who was responsible for, at the time, 2 of the 3 Blackfyre rebellions that had taken place. On his way to the Wall, men loyal to him attacked the boat and freed him so he could continue to plot and prepare for another Blackfyre rebellion. Aerys is probably the perfect example of mediocre, maybe drifting closer to the bad side when it comes to being a king. But thanks to Bloodraven, he won't be considered a garbage king. Number 9. Baelor I, the Blessed. Baelor was probably a massive bullet that was dodged by all of Westeros, despite being one of the most popular kings to the small folk, though he was not so fondly thought of by the nobility. The Iron Islands and North were likely not massive supporters either due to the massive religious differences. While he was generous, donating vast sums of money to the poor, an act that is very difficult to criticize without knowing the proper details, he wasted quite a bit of money as well when he created the Great Sept of Baelor, a massive construct that you can see anywhere in King's Landing. But credit where credit is due, you can't say he didn't practice what he preached, especially when compared to your average Septon. He made peace with Dorne after his brothers failed to conquer it, by walking all the way to House Martell barefoot through the desert, while the prisoners he escorted rode on horses. He saved a cousin that was in prison by walking through a pit of vipers, getting bit several times, and becoming bedridden for half a year. Though he also named a random stonemason as High Septon, believing the smith had blessed him, and when he died he was replaced with a child who spoke to doves, and apparently the doves answered back with the voice of the gods, so his sanity should be brought to some question. He probably took chastity a little too seriously as well, as he refused to sleep with his wife, so he didn't have any children, and he even locked up his sisters so that they may not be corrupted by the world. He later died after fasting for 40 days, though some say his uncle Viserys poisoned him so he could take the throne. Others say he did it because Baelor was planning on converting all of the non-believers to the faith of the Seven, which likely would have resulted in going to war with the North and the Iron Islands. Had those plans come to fruition, he would be much lower on this list. But since they didn't, we'll give him a solid C in ranking. Number 8. Aegon III, Dragonbane. It is a miracle that this guy didn't end up going crazy like Aerys did. After all, this guy, when he was just a child, watched his mother get burned alive by his uncle's dragon and then eaten. That would mess anyone up. Though, admittedly, he didn't exactly come out unscathed. However, if you go through that, and all that happens is you're a brooding, antisocial shut-in that doesn't like dragons? I think you're pretty lucky. Take notes, Ares. This guy was just a kid when he experienced actual horrors. Not like you, who went cuckoo for Cocoa Bus after someone pulled your beard. I'm getting off topic, though. Aegon III was a rather standard king. You can't really credit him for keeping the realm together after the Dance of Dragons, as that fell more to his council, who overruled a lot of his decisions, though he didn't make a whole lot. He did, however, help reveal traitors in his castle. However, more of that credit could fall onto his brother Viserys than himself. He may get more detail when in the next Fire and Blood book comes out, but until then, I have to leave Aegon where he is. Number 7. Maker the First. A warrior king who for 90% of their reign ruled during peace. Like previous kings, though, the good and the bad of what happened under his reign can't really be credited to him. Like his brother, Aerys, he kept Bloodraven on as his Hand of the King, who likely took care of most of the day-to-day paperwork of ruling. What gives him a bit of a boost in my eyes compared to his brother, however, was that he did make one good choice, and that was to summon his son Aemon, who was now a full-fledged maester. And in case you are wondering, yes, it's the same Maester Aemon from the Night's Watch in the books and show, so I think we can agree to summon him to advise you is always a good choice. Sadly, being a warrior, it was only fitting that Maker's life end in the battle. Leading an attack against a small rebellion, he was practically on the front lines as they sieged the castle. According to sources, he was crushed by a rock thrown from the walls. With that, we finally reached the cream of the crop, though, when it comes to kings of Westeros. We're done with the Woodrow Wilsons, and we are now talking about the Abe Lincolns and George Washingtons, leaders who, while of course they have their faults, overall are remembered as the pinnacle of what leadership should be. Number 6. Viserys II. Oh boy, this guy I feel is incredibly hard to judge. The fact of the matter is, we hear people speak very highly of Viserys, comparing him to the likes of Jaehaerys I. Tyrion himself said that he was far better suited to ruling than the nephews he served under as Hand of the King. High praise indeed, but until we get a little more in-depth with his position as the Hand of the King, I can't justify putting him higher on this list right now. Not to mention, he was the guy who raised King Aegon the Bloated, so we gotta dock a few points off there. But I'm sure once he gets a bit more in-depth to his character and to his ruling, from Hand to King, he'll probably be a lot higher on this list. Number 5. Aegon V, the Unlikely. An interesting king, popular among the small folk, but mostly despised by the nobility. The reason being is many of his decisions granted new rights and reformed the law to give more security to the small folk. This angered the nobility, who felt that their power was being greatly diminished. Naturally, still needing some sort of support from the nobility, and the fact he didn't have any dragons, Aegon reluctantly compromised on some of these decisions, at least enough so he didn't face any rebellions. He did make some attempts to try and keep the most powerful families loyal to him by arranging weddings between them and his children. However, his eldest disobeyed him to marry a commoner. He even sacrificed his right to inheritance to make sure this could happen. This started a domino effect, resulting in the next two actually sneaking off to wed each other, and for the final son to stay unmarried, since he preferred, assumingly, the company of men. His care for the small folk actually comes from his early life, where he squired under a hedge knight named Sir Duncan the Tall, who would later become the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard. Living side by side with the small folk, he understood their plight better than any other previous king, and so did what he could to fix so many issues as possible. Like many kings on this list, though, he faced his own Blackfire Rebellion, the fourth one to be specific, leading his men along with his children to fight off the invaders, showing his courage as well as his skill in arms. Probably growing frustrated that he didn't have dragons like the kings of old, he tried to hatch what eggs they had left. This, however, led to the tragedy of Summerhall, where not only Aegon died in the fire, but his eldest son, Sir Duncan the Tall, and many, many others. Number 4. Jaehaerys II. Similar to Viserys II, we don't know all the details about what made this man a great king. All we know is that apparently he mended many bridges to the nobility that his father had taken away due to giving more rights and privileges to the small folk. However, apparently he did this while keeping the new rights given to the small folk, which in my eyes Sounds impossible, but also should immediately, at the very least, put him above his father. While I can't sadly go into more detail on the exact methods or decisions he made to accomplish this, as this is pretty much just he ruled wisely and justly, like at the end of a fairy tale, the fact that he had these accomplishments cannot be disputed, at least not until we get some more info on this frail king. Number 3. Daron II, the Good. Poor Daron. Probably the only king aside from Aegon II to inherit a garbage situation. Going back to the poker analogy, Daron was probably given a 2 and a 5 of a different suit. At best, maybe a pair of 2s. Inheriting the 7 kingdoms from Aegon, the too fat to sit on a horse, Daron's accomplishments cannot be understated. He immediately took action by removing all corrupt nobles who his father put in charge and replaced them with men of merit and skill. He helped negotiate a marriage deal with the Prince of Dorne, which resulted in Dorne to finally join the 7 kingdoms, something that no previous king had accomplished despite spilling so much blood. Yet Daron did it without a drop. A good thing too, as the Dornish support would prove helpful once the first Blackfire Rebellion began. While not a great military mind, he was good at reading people, knowing who would be best of these situations, and of these skilled individuals who would claim victory. After the war, Daron was quite firm in his punishment, taking lands and titles from those who betrayed him, holding on to hostages to keep them in check as well. But he was not overtly cruel. With the exception of the Blackfires, no family was destroyed, wiped out, or banished, leaving the rest of his reign being peaceful until he passed due to the spring sickness. Number 2. Aegon I, the Conqueror. The man who started it all. Aegon the Conqueror. Now, some people might think that Aegon is overrated. He might be the man who conquered 6/7 of Westeros, but it was because he had dragons. Giving anyone else this powerful situation, they would have done the exact same thing as Aegon. And while I may not agree to quite that extent, I'll admit that Aegon may be slightly overrated. But still, being the first, he set a precedent that every single king after him would be compared to. While conquering the 7 kingdoms, Aegon showed much mercy, promising that those who bent the knee to him would be spared and allowed to keep their lands and titles. And while this really only worked on 2 of the regions, that being the North and the Vale, he still showed kindness to those who chose to fight against him. The Lannisters, for example, after suffering a massive defeat at the Field of Fire, bent the knee and were allowed to keep everything they had. The only families that were wiped out were House Hoare, who were tyrants who were willing to let everyone die to make sure that they could keep a hold of their crown. House Gardner, who seemed to have just gotten really unlucky as all the males of the family died in the Field of Fire, and the Durrandons, who, to be fair, still live on through the Baratheon line. Only Dorne did not fall, and it would be his greatest failure. But eventually he looked past his rage and looked instead to what would be best for the kingdom, and so agreed to a peace deal. After that, it was peaceful, with only a single rebellion that was quickly put down with no blood being spilled. Once that was dealt with, the realm knew peace for 24 years, which was practically unheard of when the realm was divided and the kings would constantly skirmish and battle each other for territory. While the initial cost was high, I have no doubt that in the long run, many more lives of both nobility and common folk were spared. He also made sure to pass this tidbit of wisdom with the creation of the Iron Throne. A king should never sit easy. Number 1. Jaehaerys I, the Wise. Could it have been anyone else? I am confident that a majority of you, before you even clicked on this video, knew exactly who was going to be at the top of this list. King Jaehaerys was the longest ruling king at 55 years. I don't think any other king has ruled for even half of that. In the beginning, before he was even crowned, he had to deal with plots against him from even his new hand of the king. But he was able to not only outsmart them, but also convince them and show them that there was none better suited to sit on the Iron Throne. He'd ordered the construction of the King's Road that connected all the regions under his rule, increasing trade, infrastructure, and travel speed. His laws that he passed were fair, but focused on the wealthy, increasing the prices of silk and jewelry, things no one truly needed, so that no one could claim him a tyrant for denying things they needed. The population of Westeros doubled under his reign. The only war he took part in was when Dorne launched an invasion he put down in a single battle thanks to his dragon. A famous quote describing his rule goes as such: Aegon the dragon and his sisters conquered the Seven Kingdoms, but it was Jaehaerys the Conciliator who truly made them whole. I don't think anyone can reasonably say that anyone else is more fitting of the position as he is. And that is all the Kings of Westeros. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe and like, and I will see you next time when we talk about a different group of kings.